What if this time the ANC does not win? Since 1994, South Africa has known plenty of ups and downs, but the party of Nelson Mandela, no matter the criticism or the defections, could always bank come election time on a winning machine. It's always secured an outright majority. What if it's not the case? Why would that be? We'll ask about a sluggish economy, huge inequality, corruption, whether this time incumbent fatigue will finally catch up with the African National Congress. How will those born after the fall of apartheid vote? How do they see a country long touted as the rainbow nation? Would a weakened ANC signal a new narrative for what remains a regional and continental powerhouse? The opposition includes those who tout reform, those who tout black nationalism instead of diversity. In a nation that's still got a vibrant press and an independent judiciary, will the election outcome strengthen or weaken institutions? Today, in the France 24 debate, what if the ANC doesn't win? Well, joining us from Johannesburg, Alvin Botz, member of the ANC's National Executive Committee. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Also with us from Johannesburg, Kanya Burns and Kamashe, program coordinator at the Rivonia Circle Community Organizing Group, which is founded by the leader of the new Rise Mzansi party. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
Greg Mills is director at the Brenthurst Foundation Consultancy, the author of Rich State, Poor State, Why Some Countries Fail and Others Succeed. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And France 24's Jean-Émile Jamine, who later on will be hosting our Eye on Africa broadcast. Good to see you.
Nice.
Your reactions on the hashtag F24Debate. You can also listen, like, and subscribe, by the way, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. Back in February, in his State of the Nation address, South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa illustrated all the progress on his party's watch by describing a fictional figure. He called her Tin Swallow, a woman born in 1994.
Celebrate the fact that young people, yes, like Tin Swallow, have had opportunities that were never available before.
An allegory that's apt, praise supporters, a sugar-coated view of post-apartheid South Africa for others. Is that, Alvin Botz, what you've been running on in this campaign? Has that been your message?
Yeah, look, remember, South Africa is celebrating 30 years of freedom since 1994. So the African National Congress, the ANC of Nelson Mandela, is still the same party that are loyal to the people, that envisage a better life for all. So we have a substantive track record. For example, we stood firm on the issues about social security. We stood firm on the issues about free houses for the poor, access of water, sanitation and sewerage, and, primary health care services and free education for those that, are impoverished. So that is the track record that we stand, and that is what we have presented to South Africa, that 30 years, after freedom, we are requesting a renewed mandate for 5 more years under President Ramaphosa, which has really set the path for the renewal of the ANC and for South Africa that, as envisaged by Agenda 2063, speaks about inclusive prosperity for all.
Kanya Burns and Kamashe, what have you seen in the last weeks and months? What's been the winning message that you've heard on the campaign trail?
I think from part of the work that we've done and the studies we've done as the Rivonia Circle is that a lot of South Africans right now are deeply disappointed with how our democracy is, right? A large majority of people in this country feel as though that democracy has only benefited a few. So people are now starting to organize themselves outside of formal political systems and outside of institutions, right? I think voter turnout for this election will then give us a pulse on our democracy and whether or not South Africa still believes that democracy and casting their vote will give them change. I think ours is to do a post-election analysis on how do we bring back South Africans to believing in the institution of democracy. I think 30 years into democracy, the time has come for us to innovate our democracy and see where we can strengthen the institutions that are functioning and reform and transform the institutions that aren't currently working for us in our democracy.
And we'll talk about what those reforms could be. Greg Mills, you heard there Kanya mentioning the question of voter turnout. It was 66%, I believe, last time around. What's expected?
I think people are expecting much the same. Generally, apathy has been the biggest driver of all in recent South African voting patterns. People believing that, particularly young people, and 42% of our electorate is between the ages of 18 and 59. As Kanya said, they don't perhaps feel that much is going to change. The country remains locked in very high unemployment, 42% effective if you include the expanded definition of those who stopped looking for work. We've had virtually no growth, and it's particularly prevalent in amongst the younger segments of the population. Youth unemployment stands at around 2/3 of the population. And in reality, unlike what Mr. Botha said, this has been a tale of 30 years divided into roughly two halves. The first 15 years was of relative growth, and somewhere before the changeover, before the half-time whistle blew, things started to fall apart. And the second period has been one of rampant and chronic corruption, which this government has been part of, and of course this very low growth environment which we remain stuck in. So it's really not a recent period of relative decay in South Africa. It's been more than half of the 30 years, in spite of all the early promise of the ANC period of rule. And that's, I think, that may, to answer your question, actually spur slightly greater turnout because there's more choice in this election. There's not just one or two parties. There's a whole range of newcomers. Of course, there are the big main 3 or 4 parties, but there's a range of newcomers, a range of parties with new ideas, representing a different generation of South Africans.
All right, well, let's get a snapshot of the race. Actually, let's begin with a map of the last election 5 years ago. Already then, the ANC share of the popular vote had fallen to 57%. Still, they got 270 seats, as you see there, even though they lost 19 seats, a comfortable majority in Parliament. The parts in green in that map are those won by the ANC. Now, this time, the slide, according to the polls, and polls are unreliable, is much steeper. And Jean-Yves Jamin, you just heard Greg Mills talk about the fact that there'll be more choice. If we call up again that tracking poll, does more choice favor the ANC or the opposition?
Well, we just see with the polls how they are reading compared to the last election. ANC had 57% of the vote that time. Now they're tracking, according to the Economist poll there, you see about 43%. All the similar polls from Ipsos, SFR Foundation, they're pointing to a similar area.
Yeah, somewhere between 40 and 45.
Pretty much, but all of that points to a less than majority ANC. And what that means is we are looking into the era of coalitions, and it is looking a likely outcome, but nonetheless, there are a lot of unknowns, a lot of unknown variables. Most importantly, the MK party, you see that polling at 12%. Now, some polls say it could be 8% up to 14% for Mkhonto weSizwe under Jacob Zuma. That is just one of the new parties which has emerged, the likes of Bosa as well, Rise Mzansi. These are a whole lot of new options for South Africans on the table, and more importantly,
and it's a range of options.
Absolutely, including independent candidates, which was not the case in the last elections, and that's quite a fundamental change. So in terms of who the ANC can then look to side with to form that majority, obviously that gives a whole nother range of thought for what's to come next.
What's to come next, we'll talk about it. And again, one of those keys, and was mentioned, just how big a share More than 40% of the electorate is of that so-called born-free generation, born after or too young to remember, if you will, the fall of apartheid. Our correspondent Anne Wenzel filed this report from Cape Town.
A civic education session in Cape Town at Forest Heights High School. Electoral Commission agents encourage young people to vote and explain how to do so.
So if you don't vote, you can't complain.
Of 35 voting-age students in this class, only 2 have registered to vote. They say they have lost faith in the democratic process.
There's no party that is completely made up of angels. There are people in that party, divisions that want personal gain.
We are discouraged by the empty promises and false hope.
Like, look at the school, look at the sanitary wave. They promised that they will give us better education, they will give us better stuff, but it never happens.
We're trying to get the message to them that we are not going to vote because you guys are also not taking action.
Disenchantment with the election also pervades South Africa's universities, particularly amongst the so-called born-free generation, born after the end of white minority rule in 1994. Studies show that they are not apathetic, but rather they have lost confidence in their systems of government.
If you look, for example, at the activism over there, or you look at other spaces where young people are involved, it's not necessarily that they don't want to be involved. It's just this frustration with the options which are presented to them.
Despite the Electoral Commission's best efforts, of 40 million South Africans of voting age, 13 million are expected to stay away from the polls.
We are not yet there because we are an increasingly young population, but we have benefited from the online self-registration as it relates to younger persons.
Some hope more education can erode some of the disillusionment and misinformation that have demotivated South African voters.
Maybe we should do it earlier when elections are coming up, that there's conversations and that you actually get your history teachers on board.
Electoral Commission staff have promised to return to this high school to help register everyone over the age of 18, but after the May 29 elections.
So more parties taking place, Kanya Burns and Kamashe. That younger generation, how does it see South Africa? Does it still see it as the rainbow nation? Does it want a rainbow nation? Do some want more of a black nationalist kind of country? Do some want it to be more liberal and Western style? What do they want?
I think very much young South Africans are interested in an equal, just society for everybody. However, I do think that the current democracy right now is not doing well to provide that. I mean, South African stats will show that young people are currently sitting at 60% unemployment. We have very high levels of gender-based violence and crime in the country. But I also do think that young people are also sending out a huge message to many political parties, including independent candidates as well, to say, I know what my vote is worth, and you guys are not working hard enough in order to earn my vote. A large part of what's missing in South Africa and what's discouraging a lot of South Africans is that a lot of citizens, particularly young people, are treated as though our vote matters before the election, but after the election, there's no sense of our vote giving us power. And so many people are starting to see the exercise of voting being useless as a whole because they don't see what kind of power that their vote holds afterwards. But I do think that young people are still very much involved in structural change in the country. I mean, we've seen student movements from Your Fees Must Fall, Your Roads Must Fall, Your Am I Next movement, which are large movements that have been led by fairly young people in this country. And so I think it's 30 years of democracy is signaling to us that we need to fix our political systems, our political structures, as well as our political culture as a whole in order to improve our democracy.
Alvin Bodas, it's been 10 years since we've started talking about this born-free generation. It's no longer something new. Still, how would you say this campaign is different from the previous ones?
Well, I think, look, it's 30 years. What we have done is, we execute our commitments to young people twofold. Firstly, we execute our commitments to their parents, and it's for that purpose that, as we speak, the South African social security system constitutes just over 25 million people. that are generally beneficiaries. So out of the 62 million South Africans, 25 million receive a social grant in one form or another. That includes, obviously, every child that comes from a poverty-stricken household receive a child support grant. They receive free primary school, secondary school, and tertiary school. Including in that is, a school nutrition program and free school transportation. So that is our direct intervention. In addition to that, when children that historically has been disadvantaged graduate from secondary school, they are then the recipient of a completely free government subsidy program for university studies. So that is how we.
So why are so many young people staying away from the ballot box on Wednesday or not voting for the incumbent party?
No, if you look at the fact that in the last elections, the African National Congress, the ANC, received 57% of the vote. That was a confidence by primarily young people. The polls anticipate that there may be a reluctance of young people to come to the fore tomorrow. But our own internal research have confirmed that more than 70% of young people have confidence in the leadership of President Ramaphosa and by implication the ANC. So we are buoyant, we are confident that come tomorrow we will have a large majority like any other elections that we have received.
Greg Mills, how will young people vote Wednesday?
Well, I have no idea, but the polls would seem to suggest that the ANC is not, as you termed it earlier, going to get a majority, which means that there's going to be a form of coalition government. And this is not surprising, because what Mr. Botha didn't say is that, in fact, closer to 28 million people are on social grants. We have a tax base of 7.1 million people in South Africa. We have a great deal of difficulty in creating the jobs that our young people want. Polls held over the last 3 years consistently show that 80% of South Africans believe that the country is heading in the wrong direction, and including the majority of people within the ANC itself feel that the country is moving in that direction. And interestingly enough, the big change in the last 30 years, and I think this particularly applies to this youthful generation, is that South Africans, most South Africans, a majority, blame the ANC for their plight. They no longer blame apartheid. So looking through the rearview mirror is no longer an available escape option for the ruling party. We can't say, it's because of the past that it's like this. That message rings increasingly hollow among young people. Now, whether they come out and vote is one question. Who they vote for is another question. But it does seem to be certain that we'll have a coalition government. And whether the ANC gets close to 50% or closer to 40% depends on who they'll have to cut a deal with. And they'll have to do this within 14 days after the official announcement of the results. So we're looking not just at an election tomorrow on the 29th of May, but we're looking at a very interesting political period over the next few weeks. Because unless a coalition deal is struck, if they do get under 50%, we could have a rerun of this election in September under the terms of the Constitution. So South Africa faces let's say, an interesting political series of challenges over the next 90 days.
I was going to turn to Jean-Amy, but I have to go back to Alvin just to ask him, if the ANC does fall shy, are there natural bedfellows with whom you can make a coalition, or will there be a rerun of the elections?
Look, the ANC seeks to be true to its original ideals. That is to construct a South Africa that is non-racial, non-sexist, democratic, and prosperous in its makeup. So any discussion beyond these elections would seek to obviously preempt, the standpoint of the ANC. There is absolutely no poll that have suggested unequivocally, based on historical data, that the ANC will fall below 50%. Absolutely not. We speak about 57% in the last election. There is absolutely no way that the African National Congress will share 2 million votes because that evidently will require us then to fall short of the 50% mark. Absolutely not, given the fact that as we speak, 50 million South Africans alone are using our public health health sector.
Jean-Émile Jamine, so there you have Alvin saying that the pollsters have got it very wrong. But coalition building, is that something that will be easy or hard? I guess it depends on how close the ANC would get to the 50% threshold if the polls were correct.
It's uncharted territory as far as a national election is concerned. However, we have seen it on a provincial level and more specifically, actually, in a regional level. We've seen it in the likes of Ekurhuleni in Gauteng. We've seen it in other parts. And it has the potential to really backfire and cause a stagnant political spectrum. We saw disagreements between the ANC and the EFF there in Ekurhuleni, the DA also coming in Johannesburg itself now with the Al Jamaah party, a very small minority party which has quite a radical different principle, and we're seeing then water shortages as a result of mismanagement, and that's all in the Johannesburg area as well as further abroad in terms of South Africa. But it's very much uncertain just in terms of if the ANC gets just below 50%, then they can form a coalition with one of these smaller parties, the likes of the Patriotic Alliance, although in terms of foreign policy, that's very different. The likes of the Inkatha Freedom Party, which is seen as a more market-friendly party to form a coalition with. If they get, though, more around the 40% mark, then you're looking at possibly a coalition with the hard left, an EFF or MK alliance, which investors say they're running scared from, or maybe an alliance with the Democratic Alliance, which was really unforeseen going into 2024, but now
so that would be like South Africa's equivalent of a grand coalition?
A grand coalition, you could look at a coalition of about 70% in terms of power and vote, but then the question is who can hold that to account. But it is much more centrist and a lot more market-friendly, as investors will say.
All right, just not on the ballot, and I mean, again, this is all speculation since the vote is yet to take place. Not on the ballot is Jacob Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa's predecessor, barred from topping the list of his new Mkoto Wisizwe party last week. The Constitutional Court pointing to a previous conviction, 15 months for contempt of court back in 2021, stating the rules are such that he cannot run. And you were talking earlier, Kanya Burns in Kamashe, for the need for institutional reform. But the fact that you do have these checks and balances in South Africa, a constitutional court which keeps an eye on what's going on the Electoral Council and among the candidates, the fact that Jacob Zuma did have to face up to those corruption charges, or is still facing up to them, in fact, does it not prove that the institutions do work?
No, absolutely. I do think that South Africa has very strong and stable institutions. I think the reform that I was talking about is electoral reform, in the sense that our current electoral system and our Electoral Amendment Act gives too much power to political parties instead of the people. And democracy is obviously about the people and the power of the people and people governing themselves. So part of the thing that we've been doing through our research and our workshops as well is to reimagine what South Africa's electoral system would look like if power lied within the people. So part of the thing that people have been bringing up, South Africans across rural communities, township communities, and urban communities, is the fact that they would feel like they have more power in direct representation, of which you'd know that South Africa currently has a proportional representation system. So it's things like that, looking at what would South Africa's electoral system...
So election by, just to be clear for our viewers here, election by constituencies rather than proportional representation. Yes,
that's more direct representation.
And so, because here in France, the argument's being made the opposite, that we have constituency voting in the UK. It's first past the post. And they're complaining that at least a dose of proportional representation would be welcome.
I mean, some part of this comes from the fact that in South Africa, we have what we call party lists. And so parties will decide internally who goes on that list. And so communities in South Africa feel as though they would like to be able to have a say in how the lists go, and they would like to be led by people in their communities, people whom they trust. Part of the big issue within South Africa's political culture is that people don't trust in our current government. People don't trust in the system. And so for them, giving them a more direct representation will give them that sense of accountability and that sense of transparency.
Greg Mills, they don't trust the system. But again, I ask the question, does the system work? You have, a vibrant press, independent courts. Not many places on the continent can say that.
The system works in certain parts. Parts of the state work. The judicial system works to an extent. It's not perfect. We've hardly seen any corruption cases go to trial. And even though the government and the president himself has admitted that more than a trillion rand was stolen in the state capture era under the ANC's watch, no one has been prosecuted for this. So there are bits of the judicial system that work. There are bits that work very slowly, if not imperfectly. And there's certainly bits of the state, like the police force, which need radical overhaul and reform, and especially bits around increasingly creaky infrastructure in South Africa. The bits that do work mainly connect with the private sector. And that's why you've seen this growing divide in South Africa between those who can afford the private sector to provide their basic services, privatize your electrification by installing a generator, private water, private schooling, private healthcare, and so on. And this is, in part, buffered the elite against the failings of the state. So it's somewhat schizophrenic in terms of its abilities. But the main problem in South Africa, the fundamental problem, is that we have an economy which is just growing too slowly. It's not able to provide jobs for the majority of people. We have an education system which we spend a fifth of our budget on, so a substantial chunk of change, but it doesn't deliver the sort of skills and the graduates that we want. And we have a social welfare system which is fantastic as a safety net for the most vulnerable South Africans, and no one would argue against that. But the real question is, how do you graduate people from that system? How do you get them into a more meaningful, more fulfilling role for themselves in our society? And that goes right full circle back to healthcare, education, and the growing economy. And to get a growing economy, you need an investment environment which is attractive. And that's, I think, in part because of the ANC's origins, because of the nature of the inheritance, probably the area that it struggled with the most. And as I say, that's the area that's affected younger South Africans most, and in most profound and in negative ways.
Alvin Botes, your party is a big tent party. You have different views on this topic. You could even say that your president is an incarnation of these various views. He was an ANC fighter, trade unionist, and he was also a businessman in previous lives. When you hear Greg Mills talking about the fact that those better off can buffer themselves to many of the problems, and it perhaps increases inequality by turning to the private sector, where's the pressure inside the ANC? Is it the pressure more to have a more open free market? We know, for instance, that there's been a lot of complaints from outside investors saying they don't want to invest in the mining sector anymore because they just find it too difficult in South Africa. Or is it a pressure to nationalize, to turn left?
No. Remember, the ANC in its character, it's a multi-class, organization. We have black middle structure, we have the working class and the poor. So,
but what I'm asking is, today, these days, where are you feeling the pressure more, from the left side or the right side on this?
No, I think where we do feel the pressure is obviously from the working class and the poor. Given the fact that the number of jobs created, obviously, by government stands today at 16.7 million. that has more than doubled up from the 8 million jobs which we inherited from the apartheid government in 1994. Of course, the major issue that we face with is that our economy, our economic growth averages, at the moment around 0.9%. It's monopoly-based economy, and it requires us, to have a social compact with, in particular, your private sector, to industrialize, to ensure that we increase and enhance our manufacturing to enable, manufacturing. If you look at just from the time for the last 5 years, we have investment, through President Ramaphosa of 1.5 trillion that we have recorded. That's including from the northern hemisphere, Europe, America, that have a buoyant confidence in the leadership of the African National Congress. So it may be that there has been some difficulties in certain areas, but there's an overwhelming confidence from the international community and from our domestic electorate in the leadership of the ANC.
All right, you heard earlier Greg Mills use the I word, infrastructure. Power outages have subsided in the run-up to these elections, but poor infrastructure remains a burning issue. Just ask citizens in the Indian Ocean port of Durban. They're in the throes of an acute water shortage.
We can't even use the shower. We have to put it in a bucket, and we have to pour the water on top of us. It's really, really annoying. It's very, very, and me, just now, this old hand here was getting numbed. The left hand and the left leg was getting numbed while I'm sitting in the lounge because of, carrying that water. It's too heavy. Very, very heavy.
Kanya Burns in Kamashe, the water shortages in Cape Town a couple of years back, that was a big story worldwide. Water shortages now in Durban. These infrastructure problems, the power outages, what do you do about it? How do you solve this issue?
I mean, I do think that a large majority of the issues in South Africa could be sorted out if our current ruling party would not misuse our funds. But I also do think that local municipalities, coalition governments have unfortunately not been working out in the local context. And so that also contributes to how people receive their services. I do think that South Africa needs a huge intervention when it comes to water, but it's not only water, it's a combination of load shedding. But I do think that climate change, particularly in the KZN province as well, contributes to some of the issues that they face. So perhaps then looking at researching and doing context specific, a lot of the infrastructure all around the country has not really been maintained over the past years. So perhaps our government can also look into maintaining existing infrastructure and investing in better infrastructure.
Jean-Emile Jamin?
Yeah, well, that follows on from what the Eskom chair recently said in terms of
Eskom is the national power company.
Absolutely. Eskom, national power company, and they were struggling up until a few months ago, and suddenly ahead of the election, they've seen an uptick in terms of making sure that these rolling blackouts, which South Africans have become so accustomed to, have really just fallen away. And there's a lot of skepticism to say maybe this will come back after the election. But the Eskom chair, he established the facts. He said that it's not going and burning through diesel like some skeptics have said. It's actually going individually to these power stations, making sure that the correct coal is coming through, making sure that each one of these smaller power stations is actually seen and tended to, exactly like Kanya said. It's just making sure on the small scale that everything is actually refurbished, retained, and managed correctly. Maybe we'll see that in terms of working with the private sector more. We've heard Kgosientsho Ramokgopa, the electricity minister, referring to possible work with the private sector. We've also heard Cyril Ramaphosa being more amenable to that. But then again, depends on what kind of government they do form following this election, if they do in fact need to.
This issue of power outages, of problems with infrastructure, is it the issue, Greg Mills?
No. The biggest issue in the polls, believe them or not, but they're fairly consistent on this issue, is unemployment. 30% of South Africans cite that as their major issue. Corruption is the second most important issue. Load shedding, power outages as we term them, is the third. And leadership, weak leadership, is the fourth issue. Crime is the fifth. So those are consistently, sometimes crime and weak leadership flip around, but those are the consistent issues over the last 2 years in terms of what South Africans are concerned about. And you know, it's I think it's easy to say, you know, we extended this out to many South Africans who previously didn't have power or didn't have water, and this has stressed the system. But South Africa is producing roughly about half of its installed power capacity. And this is a legacy of a lack of maintenance, as Kanya has said, about funds going missing, about dodgy contracts. Essentially, it's about governance. And if you look at government as being about two things, one is policy, the general direction you want to head in and the stipulations attached thereto, and the other is about governance. It's the governance dimension which has been so fraught, especially over the last 15 to 20 years. And this has continued to deteriorate in South Africa. Yes, there have been blips. We don't know what the reason for the lack of load shedding is now. I'd like to believe that it's Eskom's problems are solved. I guess the post-election period will tell fully what the real reason is for that. But it's really about governance. It's about how we spend our money. It's about on the projects that we spend our money. It's about the delivery associated with the money. And the real concern here related to the election is if we have a coalition government that ends up with, let's call it less a government of the left than a more populist inclined government, a coalition of MK, the EFF and the ANC, for instance, what direction will that take us in South Africa in terms of governance, as opposed to a coalition of the center, which is the other major alternative if the ANC gets below 45%. And these are the issues currently, I think, that South Africans, serious-minded South Africans, are thinking about. And because that is going to be the route to sustainably address these problems. You mentioned the Western Cape. They had a water crisis, in part because, as Kanya says, related to climate change, a lack of rainfall, in part because the Western Cape has grown enormously in terms of its population numbers over the last 15 years. It simply has been unable to keep up with the growth in the population. But still, governance does make a difference. They're back to providing water. They're back to creating more jobs than the rest of South Africa put together over the last couple of years. And they're well on their way to sort of breaking away from the national grid in terms of power. And that may be the future model for South Africa, that the power is devolved more down to the provinces. And what you are definitely going to see in this election, almost regardless of what happens at the national level, is coalition governments in Gauteng and in KZN. And as well as the Western Cape, those three provinces together make up nearly 2/3 of South Africa's GDP. So there's a terrific both challenge and as well as prospect of change in the offing, almost definitely as a result of this election tomorrow.
Yeah, there's a pull factor, as you say, to go to places where things are doing well. And that's also breeding resentment that's felt on the campaign trail, resentment against migrants. So an estimated 2.4 million of them. Their numbers have nearly tripled in 3 decades. This in a nation that has that high unemployment rate. And some politicians are trying to capitalize on that.
When we take over on the 30th of May, all the illegal foreigners, they are going home unapologetically. They are selling drugs here. They are working as cheap labor. No matter who says what, you can call me xenophobic, but I'm here for South Africans first. Patriots.
Alvin Botes, we have a far right in France which makes similar statements when it comes to migrants, particularly illegal migrants. Your thoughts, is that weighing on the campaign, the calls to kick out migrants?
No. Remember the clip that you showed of that gentleman is Gayton McKenzie of the Patriotic Alliance. Actually, he's recently out of jail. So it's a convicted criminal that spoke about this matter of migrants. South Africa are uniquely positioned as obviously the most prosperous, economy on the African state. What we obviously need to contend with is twofold. Firstly, migrants that are regularized in terms of the skills deficit are, highly, appreciated in South Africa. That includes in the financial services sector, such as in your banking industry. The key and critical issue that we are faced with is that when you have irregular migration that then competes with jobs, low-income jobs set up out for South Africans. For example, you have a minimum wage in South Africa of approximately 4,500 rand per month. What we have as a challenge is where you have your farmers, your restaurant owners that seeks to employ, illegal foreign nationals in those jobs that specifically are reserved for, low-income groups in South Africa. So our engagement as a government and as a ruling party, as the ANC, is to then engage in the social compact with private sector in relation to their obligations to respect our laws, to implement our national minimum wage. So that is where we are. But we, as South Africa, we obviously, it's an antithesis that the crime that are being committed, it's exclusively the purview of foreign African nationals. It's absolutely not the truth, and especially coming from a convicted criminal who was incarcerated for quite serious felonies.
Kanya Burns in Kamashe, if he's saying it, is because he thinks it's a vote getter. Is South Africa becoming more radical, more polarized, or is this just an election campaign like any other?
I think we can't tell at the moment. I mean, I think we have discussed earlier on in the show about how there's a lot of options right now. And so I think this election is fairly unpredictable. But I also think the introduction of independent candidates will also throw in a different spin. But I do think that a large majority of South Africans can agree that we have a huge issue around governance in this election and in our country. And so whatever government we choose, we need to have people who are capable of leading us and growing our economy so that we deal with the key issues. We deal with unemployment, we deal with crime. And so I don't think that will be solved if we don't solve our issues of government and our leadership issue.
Jean-Yves Jamin, the themes on the campaign trail in South Africa, we're 12 days from European elections here. Is it the same or is it very different?
You are seeing more migratory kind of policies towards the right and the left than you originally did see. Before it was much more those aligned with the ANC and the struggle after apartheid versus those who maybe harked back to those times. Now it's much more divergent on economic threads, which is what you're seeing in the European parliamentary elections. That being said, South Africa is quite a unique melting pot of those political views. And at the end of the day, exactly what our guests have said, it's all about governance. And the policies are not so different if you're looking at the ANC more towards the center, the DA, and just around that aspect. But it's all about how those policies have been implemented. And that's what the parties are trying to offer as a different alternative.
Yeah, you campaign in verse and govern in prose. I can't help but notice, again, the lack of gray hair on the top of your head, Jean-Emile, and I'll ask you the question. The apartheid era, is that just something for the history books, or is it still something relevant today?
No, absolutely not. It's very much still relevant. You have to bear in mind the duration that apartheid was in place for and all the colonial aspects before. But you can say two things at the same time. One, the ANC had to deal with apartheid, and two, how it dealt with apartheid, is that up to standard, and how it's basically gone forward. And a lot of people will say it's not, and that's reflected in what the polling is saying before this election.
And it is, of course, unpredictable, the polling, as it is everywhere. So we'll see what happens. Jean-Yves Jamin, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank Alvin Botes, Kanya Burns in Kamashe, Greg Mills for being with us from Johannesburg. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.